The second millennium BCE was an age of colliding powers. Across the ancient Near East, kingdoms rose and collapsed with a ferocity that reshaped civilizations and erased entire peoples from the map. Among all the forces that emerged from this crucible of conflict, none would prove as enduring, as methodical, or as terrifying as the armies of Assyria. For nearly 6 centuries, the heartland of northern Mesopotamia, the land between the upper Tigris and its tributaries, gave birth to a military culture unlike anything the ancient world had yet produced. The story of Assyria is not merely the story of conquest. It is the story of how a people surrounded by enemies transformed necessity into empire, and how that empire, in its relentless expansion, ultimately carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. What followed was 6 centuries of war, administration, terror, and genius. A civilization that remade the ancient world in its own violent image. It began beside a river, in a city built on a cliff, in a land surrounded by enemies. And it began not with conquest, but with commerce, and the discovery that wealth without power is merely an invitation to predation. The city of Assur sat on a rocky promontory above the western bank of the Tigris, its position a gift and a burden at the same time. On 3 sides, the terrain offered natural defense. On the 4th, the open steppe stretched toward hostile neighbors. From its earliest days, Assur was a city that understood the cost of vulnerability. The citizens who built their temples to the god Assur were not warriors by instinct. They were traders. The earliest records from Assur describe merchant colonies established deep in Anatolia. Networks of commerce stretching hundreds of kilometers through mountain passes and across harsh plateau land. Tin, textiles, and silver moved along these routes in quantities that made Assur wealthy and its merchants influential. But wealth without power is merely an invitation to predation. The collapse of the old Assyrian trading network forced a reorientation of Assyrian ambitions. When trade could no longer sustain the city turned to other means. The transformation was gradual, but its direction was unmistakable. Assyria would become a state whose survival depended not on the caravans of merchants, but on the campaigns of armies. The emergence of Assyria as a genuine military power began in earnest during what historians call the Middle Assyrian period, roughly spanning 14th to the 11th centuries BCE. This era saw the consolidation of royal authority, the construction of administrative systems capable of organizing large military forces, and the first sustained campaigns of territorial expansion. King Adad-nirari I, who ruled in the early 13th century BCE, set a template that his successors would follow with increasing ambition. He extended Assyrian control westward into the territory of the Mitanni kingdom, a rival power that had dominated northern Mesopotamia for generations. The defeat of Mitanni was not simply a military victory. It was a statement of intent. Assyria was no longer content to occupy its corner of the world. It intended to remake the entire map of the Near East. Each campaign was recorded, each victory immortalized in stone. A civilization learning to project power not just by force, but by memory. The clay tablets that survive from this period document an administrative revolution as significant as any military one. Territory that had been Mitanni for generations was now Assyrian, and the kings who followed Adad-nirari understood precisely what that meant. City that had once measured its greatness in merchant caravans now measured it in the strength of its garrison. A professional army, trained, housed, fed, and paid by the state, was coming into existence. Nothing like it had been seen in this part of the world before. These were not seasonal warriors called from their farms. They were soldiers by profession, loyal to the crown, trained for war as a vocation. And each generation of Assyrian kings who followed would push further drawn by the logic of an empire that could survive only by expanding. The origins of the Assyrian war machine lay not in a single decision, but in a century of transformation, from a city of merchants to the heart of the ancient world's most powerful empire. Understanding how Assyria achieved what no other state before it had managed requires understanding the instruments it deployed. The Assyrian army was not a collection of tribal warriors summoned for seasonal raids. It was a professional institution, trained, organized, equipped, and sustained by a centralized state. At the core of Assyrian military power was the infantry. The heavily armed spearmen formed the backbone of engagements, while alongside them operated the archers. Among the most skilled bowmen in the ancient world, Assyrian composite bows, constructed from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, had a range and penetrating power that contemporary observers found remarkable. Reliefs carved on palace walls across centuries of Assyrian history return again and again to the image of the archer, standing, kneeling, shooting from horseback, loosing arrows from siege towers. It was not any single weapon that made Assyria dangerous. It was the integration of all these capabilities into a single coherent system. The chariot played a significant role in Assyrian warfare, though its function evolved over time. In earlier periods, the Assyrian chariot was light, designed for speed, for devastating archery, for pursuit. As the centuries passed, Assyrian chariots grew heavier. By the era of the Great Empire, the standard war chariot carried 3 or even 4 men, drawn by a team of 4 horses, armored with bronze and leather. The thunder of hundreds of such vehicles moving in formation across hard ground was an experience that ancient sources consistently describe as terrifying. The true innovation was not any single weapon or tactic, but integration. Assyrian kings understood, earlier and more completely than their rivals, that battles are won before they begin. The logistics of campaign, the movement of grain, the management of water, the construction of roads and bridges received as much administrative attention as the tactics of the battlefield itself. River crossings, mountain passes, desert marches, each was planned in advance, supplied in advance, anticipated. The army arrived ready to fight because it had been fed and rested along the way. Siege equipment was disassembled, transported, and reassembled at the walls of target cities, a feat of logistical planning that most armies of the era could not have managed. Royal inscriptions boast not only of enemies slain, but of rivers crossed, mountains traversed, and deserts marched across. These were genuine achievements of organizational planning, not rhetorical embellishment. Behind every army that marched out of Assur or Nineveh stood a state that had organized itself entirely around the capacity to wage war at a distance. No army can field a chariot force without horses, and no horses appear without breeding programs, pasture land, and systematic management of herds across the empire. The men who filled the ranks were trained as professionals, not drafted and sent to war within weeks, drilled, hardened, and integrated into formations that moved as a single body. Their equipment reflected the state's investment in their survival. Bronze-scale armor, composite bows, wicker shields, each piece the product of organized manufacture, not individual provision. A general conducting inspection was not checking on farmers who happened to carry spears. He was reviewing a professional military establishment, built and maintained at state expense. Every unit carried its identity into battle. Every soldier knew which formation he belonged to, which officer commanded it, and what was expected of him when the order to advance was given. Coordination was not left to chance or individual initiative. It was trained, rehearsed, and enforced by a command structure that extended from the king down to the unit leader of 10 men. The army maintained itself constantly, Between campaigns, there was training. Between battles, there was maintenance. The machine never fully rested. The result was a fighting force of remarkable versatility. It could besiege a city, fight a pitched battle, conduct a cavalry raid, or suppress a rebellion, and shift between these tasks with practiced efficiency. When this army marched, the cities in its path had a decision to make, and the Assyrians had spent considerable effort making sure that decision was not a difficult one. This was the instrument that would reshape the ancient world. Not a horde, not a tribal levy, but a state-built, state-funded, state-directed machine of organized violence. No aspect of Assyrian military capability impressed or terrified the ancient world more than its approach to fortified cities. Every major power of the Bronze and Iron Ages built walls. The city wall was the fundamental security investment of ancient statecraft, the structure that transformed a settlement into a stronghold. Against the walls of Babylon or Jerusalem or Tyre, an army without siege expertise would exhaust itself in months of futile assault. The Assyrians had no intention of being so humiliated. Assyrian siege engineering developed over centuries into the most sophisticated system of its kind in the ancient world. Siege ramps allowed battering rams to reach walls at the level where stone could be effectively attacked. These rams were not simple beams. They were purpose-built machines, heavy timber heads in armored housing, operated by teams of soldiers working in rhythmic unison. While the rams struck below, archers stationed on the upper decks of the siege tower suppressed the defenders on the walls. A combination that made defense enormously costly. The defenders were not passive. They dropped stones. They poured hot oil. They fired arrows down onto the men pushing the ram. But the Assyrians had prepared for all of this. The goal was not simply to destroy the fortifications, but to exhaust the defenders, to make continued resistance feel not like heroism but like slow suicide. Where ramps were impractical, Assyrian engineers turned to mining. Tunnels dug beneath walls undermined foundations, which were then burned out to cause collapse. Assault parties attacked gates with axes and crowbars under cover of large body shields. Scaling ladders were deployed at multiple points simultaneously to divide the defenders' attention. And throughout all of this, a continuous storm of archery fire was maintained to make movement on the walls costly, to wear down the men defending them hour after hour. The Assyrian siege was not a single technique but a system. Multiple methods applied simultaneously, each one compounding the pressure on defenders who could not be everywhere at once. Exhaustion, casualties, disease, dwindling food and water. The siege did not need to breach the walls if it could first break the will of the people behind them. Eventually, almost all of them fell. The city that held out longest was not the one with the strongest walls. It was the one whose defenders were willing to die last. When cities fell, the consequences were calibrated to serve Assyrian strategic purposes. Populations that had resisted long sieges might be enslaved in entirety. Their fate made widely known as a lesson to other cities that continued. Resistance was not in their interest. The physical destruction of a city, the burning of its temples, the demolition of its walls, the scattering of its people, was sometimes carried out as a demonstration so thorough that no future king could use that location as a basis of resistance. At other times, Assyrian rulers were surprisingly pragmatic, preferring to resettle skilled craftsmen and administrators within Assyria itself, where their labor and knowledge could strengthen the empire. The empire consumed talent and skill as readily as it consumed grain and timber and silver. The deportation was both a punishment and a harvest. Some cities were erased so completely that later generations could not find them. The message was permanent. The lesson was written in ruins. Every campaign was documented. Every city taken was recorded. Every prisoner counted. The empire needed to know what it had destroyed, what it had taken, and what it had gained. The king observed. He commanded. He was the architect of the siege and the final authority over the fate of those inside the walls. And when it was over, a messenger rode to the next city, carrying not just news but a question. Would they make the same choice, or would they open their gates? More often than not, they opened their gates. Because the Assyrians had made very sure that everyone within reach knew exactly what happened, cities that did not. As Assyrian conquests expanded, the challenge of administration became as pressing as the challenge of warfare. An army could subdue a province. Keeping it subdued required something more. The empire was divided into provinces, each administered by a governor appointed directly by the king. Not a local ruler, but an Assyrian official, responsible to the crown. These governors were rotated between positions to prevent the accumulation of personal power and loyalty networks that might threaten central control. Each governor was responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, organizing labor for royal building projects, and supplying the army when it passed through his territory. The deportation policy that Assyria pursued with systematic consistency was both a security measure and an economic tool. When a conquered population was deported to a distant region, it was simultaneously denied the networks that made organized resistance possible and placed in an environment dependent on Assyrian goodwill for its survival. Skilled workers, weavers, metalworkers, stone carvers, scribes were of particular value. Assyrian kings competed with one another in the grandeur of their palace construction. The vast reliefs and inscriptions that once covered the walls of Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh were the products of artistic traditions gathered from across the known world. Their correspondence with the royal court, thousands of clay tablets preserved in the Great Archive at Nineveh, documents an administrative system of remarkable detail and thoroughness. The Assyrian king knew what was happening in his provinces because his governors were required to report regularly and in writing. Silence was not permitted. The royal ideology that undergirded this system was expressed with sophisticated consistency. The Assyrian king was not merely a political ruler. He was the representative on earth of the god Assur. Every campaign was therefore simultaneously a military operation and a religious duty. Enemies of Assyria were enemies of divine order itself. Their defeat was not merely a political outcome, but a cosmic necessity. A framing that gave soldiers justification, delegitimized resistance, and made the king's authority inseparable from divine will. The palace at Nimrud announced to every visitor that Assyria was not simply the strongest power in the region, but a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. In the throne room, the empire made itself visible. Every nation that paid tribute was represented. Every conquest was present in the goods that arrived each year. The roads the army built to move troops and supplies also moved merchants. Empire and commerce were inseparable in the Assyrian mind. Governors were rotated. Power was monitored. The center watched the provinces, and the provinces knew they were being watched. When rebellions occurred, and they did, they were suppressed with calculated speed. The empire could not afford to let any defiance go unanswered. The communication network that sustained this system was the nervous system of the empire. Clay tablets moving on horseback across thousands of kilometers, keeping the center informed. For the millions who lived within the empire's reach, Assyrian rule was a fact of existence. A system that extracted what it needed and left behind roads, markets, and the memory of power. The empire was not simply a territory. It was a system of extraction, of organization, of controlled violence applied at scale. generation after generation. At its height, this system governed more people across more territory than any state that had come before it. And it worked for a time. The 9th through 7th centuries BCE represent the peak of Assyrian power, a period that produced rulers whose names were spoken with dread across half of the known world. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, established the pattern that his successors would follow. His campaigns ranged from the mountains of Urartu to the shores of the Mediterranean. His palace at Nimrud announced to every visitor that Assyria was not simply the strongest power in the region, but a civilization of extraordinary sophistication. The stone reliefs that lined his palace walls depicted his campaigns in extraordinary detail. The assault of cities, armies crossing rivers, tribute received, and the fates of those who dared to resist. The wealth that flowed into Assur from these campaigns was staggering. Gold, cedar, exotic animals, craftsmen, horses, the empire fed itself on the produce of its conquests. His son Shalmaneser III extended these campaigns further. Facing a coalition of Levantine states at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, one of the largest battles attested in ancient records. The biblical king Ahab of Israel was among those who brought troops to oppose the Assyrian advance, a detail that illustrates how far Assyrian ambitions had extended beyond their Mesopotamian heartland. Shalmaneser did not destroy this coalition, but he did not need to. The costs of repeated campaigns gradually eroded the capacity of the Levant to resist. The greatest of all Assyrian rulers, by most measures, was Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in 745 BCE following a period of internal instability. His reforms of the army and administration transformed Assyria into the most powerful state the ancient world had yet seen. He reduced dependence on feudal levies and increased full-time professional soldiers. He reformed the provincial system, breaking up large provinces that had become power bases for ambitious governors and replacing them with smaller, more manageable units. Sargon II destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE and deported its population, an event that entered biblical and historical memory as a catastrophe without equal. The 10 tribes of Israel vanished into the Assyrian deportation system. Resettled across the empire, their identity dissolved into the vast machinery of Assyrian administration. Sennacherib marched against Jerusalem, though the city was ultimately spared in circumstances that remain disputed among historians and theologians. Alike to this day, he sacked Babylon in 689 BCE, an act that shocked the ancient world, given that city's sacred significance. No Assyrian king had dared this before, and yet he rebuilt Nineveh on a scale that made it arguably the largest and most magnificent city in the world, as if to prove that destruction and creation were two expressions of the same power. Esarhaddon conquered Egypt in 671 BCE, the first foreign power to do so since the Hyksos 6 centuries earlier. It required a march across the Sinai Desert that would have defeated a less capable logistical organization. The pharaoh submitted. Egypt, the ancient world's other great power, civilization of the Nile, conqueror of the Levant, bowed to an Assyrian king. Ashurbanipal, the last of the great Assyrian kings, was that rare thing, a conqueror who was also a scholar. He campaigned ruthlessly, and then he built a library. At Nineveh, he assembled the greatest library of cuneiform tablets in history, a collection ranging from astronomy to medicine to literature that preserved much of what we know about ancient Mesopotamian civilization. He sent agents across the empire to collect and copy texts. It was not conquest in the military sense, but it was the same imperial instinct applied to knowledge. Under Ashurbanipal, the empire reached its maximum extent. From Egypt to Persia, from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of the Iranian plateau. The lion hunt reliefs from his palace at Nineveh represent the pinnacle of Assyrian art, images of controlled, royal violence that speak directly to how this civilization understood power. Nineveh at its height was the largest and most magnificent city in the world. Its walls stretched for kilometers. Its palaces were filled with the treasures of a dozen conquered civilizations. These were the great kings of Assyria. Their names still echo. Their empires are dust. But for 3 centuries, they were the most powerful men in the world. The operational reality of an Assyrian campaign was an experience of sustained logistical challenge that tested the limits of ancient organizational capacity. An army of the late Assyrian Empire, perhaps 40 to 50,000 fighting men, accompanied by support personnel and animals that could double that number, required provisions on a scale that exceeded the carrying capacity of any supply column. The march was organized with precision. Elite units moved at the front and rear. The bulk of the infantry and the baggage train occupied the center. Chariotry and cavalry provided flank security and rapid reconnaissance, screening the main body against surprise attack and identifying possible ambush positions ahead. River crossings, always a moment of dangerous vulnerability for any army, were managed with inflated animal skin rafts or by pontoon bridges when the crossing force was large enough to justify the effort. The empire had crossed enough rivers that its engineers had developed standard procedures for doing so quickly, safely, and under potential enemy observation. The cavalry arm of the Assyrian military underwent a fascinating evolution. In the earliest representations, Assyrian horsemen still required a companion to control their horses while they shot. Over the following centuries, saddle design, riding technique, and the selective breeding of larger horses combined to produce a cavalry capable of independent tactical action. By the height of the empire, Assyrian cavalry pursued broken enemies, screened infantry flanks, conducted deep raids, and delivered intelligence at a speed no foot soldier could match. The deep cavalry raid became one of the Assyrian army's most effective strategic tools, striking at an enemy's economic base while the main army was still days away. Coordination between these arms on the battlefield required communication systems of real sophistication. Signal fires and banners transmitted orders across the noise and confusion of ancient battle. The king himself, in idealized representations, appears at the center of the fighting, visible to his troops, guiding the battle with his presence and his commands. In practice, Assyrian kings often delegated tactical command to trusted generals while reserving strategic direction for themselves, a sensible division of labor that allowed the most capable mind to stay focused on the larger picture. The supply chain was not an afterthought. It was the campaign. Without the wagons, the army stopped. Without the grain, the soldiers scattered. Without the horses, the cavalry vanished. The army supplemented its supply columns with systematic foraging, seizing grain stores and livestock as each region was entered. The land fed the army whether the locals cooperated or not. Each night, the army made camp with practiced efficiency. The defensive perimeter was established. The guards were posted. The horses were fed. The equipment was checked. Intelligence was gathered continuously. Scouts ranged ahead of the main force. Prisoners were questioned. Local informants were cultivated. The Assyrian commander rarely moved blind. When battle was joined, the Assyrian deployment followed established patterns. Infantry in the center, chariots on the wings, cavalry on the flanks. Each arm assigned its role in the system. The chariot charge against infantry not protected by its own chariot force was devastating. The thunder of hundreds of vehicles at full speed across hard ground could break a formation before contact. The archers on those chariots were trained to shoot accurately from a moving platform, a skill that required years of practice and horses bred and trained to hold their line. When the enemy line broke, and under sustained Assyrian pressure, it usually did, the exploitation was immediate. Cavalry closed the gaps. Chariots pursued the fleeing. There was no safe direction to run, and then the scribes counted the dead, cataloged the prisoners, listed the captured equipment, and wrote the report that would travel back to Nineveh on a clay tablet. The machine moved on. No analysis of Assyrian military power is complete without attention to the deliberate cultivation of terror as a strategic instrument. This was not savagery for its own sake. It was a calculated policy, applied with awareness of its effects on the decision-making of future opponents. The inscriptions in which Assyrian kings described the fates of rebellious cities were not composed to satisfy bloodlust. They were composed to be read by the rulers of cities that had not yet submitted. The message was explicit. Resistance is futile and costly. Submission is safe and profitable. The empire was in the business of persuasion, by example. This policy had genuine strategic logic. An empire this size could not keep a large army in every province simultaneously. The army moved. Terror was the garrison it left behind. The more visceral and memorable the demonstration of Assyrian power, the longer the interval before a local ruler's calculations might tilt toward defiance. A city that had watched its neighbor burned to the ground, and its population marched into slavery, had a powerful, immediate reference point for evaluating its own options. Yet the policy had limits that the Assyrians discovered only gradually. Populations that had nothing to lose from resistance fought with a desperation that could be costly even for the most capable army in the world. The sieges that Assyrian reliefs depicted as clean, efficient operations were often extended, difficult affairs, draining resources and time the empire needed elsewhere. And the repeated deportations that Assyria relied on to neutralize conquered populations had an unintended effect, spreading Assyrian administrative techniques and military knowledge to regions that would eventually use that knowledge against their conquerors. When a population understood that surrender meant enslavement and deportation, regardless, the calculus changed. Fear that had kept cities submissive could tip, under extreme pressure, into ferocity. The empire sowed the seeds of its own undoing in the populations it displaced, carrying Assyrian knowledge of logistics, siege engineering, and military organization to every corner of the Near East. Cyaxares of the Medes would study Assyrian military methods and use them against Assyria. The Babylonians would use Assyrian administrative systems to build the empire that succeeded it. Terror was the foundation of empire, effective, calculated, and ultimately finite. Empires built on fear last only as long as the fear does. Assyria did not lack for opponents. The geography of the Near East surrounded it with rivals of varying character and capability, each presenting a different military challenge. To the north, the kingdom of Urartu posed a persistent and serious problem. Centered on the highlands around Lake Van, Urartu had studied Assyrian methods carefully and built defenses specifically designed to resist them. Urartian fortresses sat on rocky heights that negated much of the advantage of Assyrian siege engineering. The machines that terrified cities on open plains were useless on mountain peaks. Urartian cavalry operated with effectiveness in mountain terrain that disrupted Assyrian formations accustomed to open ground. Several Assyrian campaigns against Urartu ended in costly failure. The campaign of Sargon II in 714 BCE illustrated the continuing evolution of Assyrian operational thinking, bypassing impregnable fortresses entirely to strike the undefended economic heartland. To the east, the emerging power of the Medes presented a different kind of challenge. A tribal confederacy, whose military strength lay in cavalry, and whose lack of fixed settlements made it largely immune to the siege-centered approach Assyria had refined. The Medes could not be conquered by seizing their capital, because they had no capital in the conventional sense. They could be raided, but they could not be absorbed. The growing power of the Medes, through the 7th century BCE, represented a category of threat for which Assyrian institutional capabilities were poorly matched. To the west, the Egyptian question dominated Assyrian strategic thinking for generations. Egypt was the only power in the region capable of matching Assyrian resources. Egypt's consistent interference in the politics of the Levant, supporting anti-Assyrian coalitions, sheltering refugees, providing material support to resistant states, made it a target that Assyria could not ignore indefinitely. The conquest of Egypt by Esarhaddon in 671 BCE was a genuine achievement of extraordinary ambition, involving a march across the Sinai Desert under conditions that would have defeated a less capable logistical organization. But the occupation of Egypt proved beyond Assyrian capacity to sustain. The Nile Valley was too distant from the Assyrian heartland, the Egyptian population too large, too deeply embedded in its own identity. The administrative demands of governing both Egypt and the rest of the empire simultaneously were too great for even the most capable Assyrian king to manage. Within a generation, Egypt had recovered its independence. The failure in Egypt was the first clear signal that the empire had reached the limits of what any ancient state could administer: supply and defend simultaneously. 3 frontiers, 3 different enemies, 3 different military challenges requiring 3 different responses, and a single empire trying to fund and staff all of them at once. The army that had seemed limitless was not. The treasury that had seemed inexhaustible was not. The administrative capacity that had governed the world was beginning to strain. The enemies of Assyria were learning. They were studying. They were waiting. And in the kingdoms to the east and south, the coalition that would finally destroy the empire was slowly taking shape. The very success of Assyrian expansion created the conditions for its failure. An empire, stretching from Egypt to Persia, required administrative capacity that consistently outran the human resources available to operate it. The reign of Ashurbanipal was consumed in significant part by a civil war against his own brother, whom their father Esarhaddon had appointed as king of Babylon. The arrangement contained within itself the logic of eventual conflict. The war lasted 4 years, from 652 to 648 BCE. While Ashurbanipal emerged victorious and Babylon was sacked in punishment for its resistance, the cost in Assyrian blood and resources was enormous. The empire that Ashurbanipal ruled after this victory was significantly weaker than the one he had inherited. He had won, but the empire had bled. An army that campaigned every year suffered casualties faster than the Assyrian heartland could replace them. The solution, incorporating conquered peoples into the military, was both rational and dangerous. Troops who had been enemies in the previous decade were not always reliable soldiers in the present one. Commanders of non-Assyrian origin accumulated personal loyalties that competed with their loyalty to the crown. The provincial governors who managed the empire's vast territory were products of a culture that rewarded ambition. The temptation to translate enormous power into a bid for greater things was one that several of them could not resist. The succession question was a recurring source of instability. Kings who chose their successors faced the resentment of other princes. Those who failed to choose faced even more dangerous competition. From the outside, the empire still appeared invincible. Nineveh still gleamed. The palaces were still magnificent. The armies still marched, but the foundations underneath were cracking. The empire was no longer expanding. Expansion had been its mechanism for sustaining itself. New tribute, new populations, new resources. Without expansion, the system began to consume itself. The men who held the empire together were the soldiers in the frontier garrisons, the administrators in the provincial capitals, the scribes keeping the records. They were tired, and the enemies gathering on the horizon were not. By the final decades of the 7th century BCE, the forces that would destroy Assyria were assembling with a speed that the empire's remaining strength could not arrest. The Medes, under Cyaxares, had transformed themselves from a loose tribal confederation into a disciplined military power that had studied and absorbed Assyrian methods. To the south, Nabopolassar of Babylonia formed a military alliance with the Medes specifically to achieve the destruction of Assyrian power. The two forces together represented a strategic combination that Assyria, with its resources depleted by decades of civil conflict and overextension, could not effectively oppose. In 614 BCE, the Medes sacked Assur, the original heart of Assyrian civilization, the city from which the whole enterprise had begun 6 centuries earlier. In 612 BCE, the combined forces besieged Nineveh, the greatest city in the ancient world, defended by walls that had taken generations to build, by a garrison that fought with the determination of men who knew what their city's fall would mean. Held for only 3 months, when the walls were breached, ancient sources mention flooding that contributed to their collapse. The resistance ended quickly. The city that had stood as the center of world power fell in days. Nineveh was systematically destroyed. The palaces whose walls had once displayed the confidence of world empire were burned and buried. The city that had terrified the ancient world was itself erased. The library of Ashurbanipal, with its tens of thousands of clay tablets, was buried under the ruins where it would remain for 2.5 millennia until 19th century archaeologists uncovered it. The remnants of the Assyrian army retreated westward, making a final stand at Haran with Egyptian support that arrived too late and proved too little. By 605 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed the last Assyrian forces at the Battle of Carchemish, the empire was gone, not merely defeated, gone. Unlike Babylon, which would be conquered and reconquered, but remain a living city for centuries, Assyria, as a political and cultural entity, essentially ceased to exist. Its heartland cities were abandoned, its ruling class destroyed or dispersed. The administrative systems that had governed millions dissolved within a generation. What remained was the inheritance. Every major power that followed Assyria in the Near East built on Assyrian foundations, in ways they sometimes acknowledged and sometimes did not. Cyrus the Great, whose Persian Empire superseded the Babylonian successor state within a generation of Nineveh's fall, adapted the Assyrian model of provincial administration while deliberately rejecting its most brutal elements. The cuneiform records that survived the destruction, on clay tablets that fire could not destroy, preserved knowledge of a civilization of far greater depth and sophistication than its martial reputation had suggested. Astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, mathematical texts of considerable complexity, literary compositions that included the Epic of Gilgamesh in its most complete surviving form, medical texts, administrative records, all of it buried, all of it recovered. These are the things that outlasted the war machine. The careful records of a civilization that watched the stars even as it burned its neighbors, cities. The reliefs that once lined the halls of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal have been studied, photographed, and in some cases removed to museums in London, Paris and Chicago, where they remain as evidence of a civilization that built its power on violence and preserved its memory in stone. The ruins of that city lie today beneath the modern suburbs of Mosul in northern Iraq. The gates have been excavated, the palaces partially uncovered, and in recent years, some have been deliberately destroyed. History returning to dust a second time. The roads that Assyrian armies had built to move troops and supplies continued to carry trade long after the last Assyrian soldier had marched on. The military techniques that Assyrian commanders had developed continued to shape how armies fought. The administrative categories that Assyrian governors had invented continued to organize the collection of taxes. The template of empire, multi-ethnic, professionally administered, militarily sustained, was an Assyrian invention, and the memory of Assyrian power continued to shape how kings thought about the ambitions and the dangers of empire. Long after the last soldier in an Assyrian uniform had laid down his weapons and walked away into the historical silence, the river still flows. The land between the rivers is still there. The cities are mounds of earth in the Iraqi desert, and somewhere beneath that earth, the clay tablets wait, recording in careful cuneiform the names of kings who thought their empire would last forever. 6 centuries of empire. From a merchant city on a cliff above the Tigris to the greatest power the ancient world had ever seen. And then, in the space of a single decade, to nothing. The Assyrian war machine is the story of how empires are made and how they end.